Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 746, and today is January 16th, 2025. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. A lot to talk about on today's show: the war in Ukraine, and more importantly, the ceasefire deal that's supposed to be taking place on Sunday in Gaza now looks like it may be dead before it even gets started. So be sure to share today's program. It is hosted at the Libertarian Institute, reposted on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee for the video version of the show. You can follow me on Twitter at @KyleAnzalone_ to find all my work, all the articles that I write, the emails that I put out, daily news roundups, this show, and of course the all-new Kyle Anzalone show, which you can also subscribe to. It is the top link in the show notes page. All right, let's get rolling on today's news. The first story I have is from, I wrote it for the Libertarian Institute. Ukraine claims to barrage Russia with largest missile and drone attack since the start of the war. So Ukrainian officials say they bombarded Russia with a massive missile and drone attack. Moscow says part of that attack was aimed at the Turk Stream pipeline. Ukrainian officials said a drone attack on Monday night was the largest Kiev has launched against Russia since the start of the war. Russian forces said over 200 Ukrainian drones and missiles were downed. Kiev says it targeted Russian weapons production plants, oil refineries, and warehouses. Russian sources report the munitions hit industrial and energy infrastructure. Among the targets, the Kremlin says, is the Turk Stream pipeline. The pipeline carries gas from Russia through the Black Sea and onto Western Turkey. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov blasted Washington for the Ukrainian attack. He said, "The U.S. does not tolerate competition in any sphere, including energy. They are recklessly endorsing terrorist activities aimed at undermining the energy stability of the European Union. They are encouraging their Ukrainian proxies to disable the Turk Stream following the sabotage of Nord Stream." So Nord Stream was a series of 4 pipelines that moved gas to Germany. In September of 2022, 3 of the 4 pipelines were destroyed by explosives in a sabotage attack. The last of the Nord Stream pipelines remains closed due to sanctions on Moscow. Russia says it downed 9 drones targeting the Turk Stream pipeline. The pipeline is the last operating pipeline bringing Russian energy from to the European Union. So at the start of the year, Ukraine refused to renew a gas transit deal with Russia, shuttering a Soviet-era pipeline that runs from Russia through Ukraine and then on to Slovakia. Slovakia has reacted sharply to Kiev ending the gas flows, with Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico threatening to cut energy transfers to Kiev. And so there's a lot going on here when it comes to energy. And while it would seem crazy that Ukraine would blow up another Russian pipeline, it does seem that that is possibly something that they are attempting at this point in the conflict. All right, moving on here. This one from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. So this one published January 14th. Zelensky, Macron discussed the idea of French troops deploying to Ukraine. So on Monday, the Ukrainian President Zelensky said he spoke with his French counterpart, Emmanuel Macron, and discussed the idea of possibly deploying French troops to Ukraine as a part of a potential future security guarantee. Zelensky said Macron discussed achieving peace and developing effective security guarantees. The Ukrainian president wrote on X, "As one such guarantee, we discussed the French initiative to deploy military contingencies to Ukraine. We addressed practical steps for its implementation, potential expansion, and the involvement of other nations in this effort." So Russia would never agree to a NATO deployment in Ukraine as part of a future peace plan, since one of its main demands is for Ukrainian neutrality. And of course, if NATO is deployed to Ukraine, that kind of eliminates the neutrality aspect. So the Wall Street Journal recently reported that President-elect Donald Trump has suggested European troops should be sent to Ukraine to monitor a future ceasefire, but Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov rejected the idea. Last year, Macron was calling for NATO troop deployments to Ukraine to train Ukrainian soldiers and said at one point he was finalizing the plan. But he appeared to back down after warnings from Russia that French troops would be considered legitimate military targets. The Discord leaks revealed that as of March 2023, there are a small number of NATO special operators inside Ukraine, including at least 15 French troops. But Macron has been calling for a larger public deployment to Ukraine. And so that would obviously be a significant escalation, hopefully something that we could avoid. Now, a little bit of bad news on the Ukraine front. President-elect, not president-elect, but as candidate, during the election cycle on the campaign trail, Donald Trump was the man who was talking about ending the war in Ukraine. And, he was saying he would bring it to an end on day one. Well, it appears now that they are no longer even suggesting that and saying the deal could take months or even longer. So Dave DeCamp writes at antiwar.com, advisors to President-elect Donald Trump have conceded that a deal to end the war in Ukraine will likely take months or potentially even longer. Two unnamed Trump associates who spoke with Reuters described Trump's promise to end the conflict within 24 hours as, quote, campaign bluster and a lack of understanding about the war. Keith Kellogg, the Trump's incoming envoy to the conflict, has said he hopes to have a deal within the first 100 days of the administration. Trump's incoming national security advisor, Mike Waltz, has also said the next administration will ask Ukraine to lower its conscription age from 25 to 18 to stabilize the battlefield. It's a sign that he could expect the war could continue for 6-9 months a year, right? If you're training hundreds of thousands of new troops, that is not something that's going to make an impact on the battlefield after a day, a week, a month, 3 months, 4, 5, 6 months. Even you do an expedited training, like a 3-month training program or something like that. Well, then essentially you're just throwing these people there to be meat beds until they're killed by the Russians, blown up by bombs. It takes a lot of training to be able to execute the complicated defensive and offensive maneuvers needed in this conflict. And so the idea that they're just going to quickly train these soldiers and that they will immediately become available on the battlefield and stabilize the front lines is absolutely stupid. And it's going to get a lot of people killed. And so if all this is a sign, like if the Trump administration is really pushing Ukraine to engage in more conscription, then I think we should assume that they are thinking that this war is going to be fought for at least another year, because that's when those soldiers would probably be actually ready to fight in any kind of meaningful way. And that's a long way down the road. So it's also unclear what sort of deal the Trump administration might offer Russia that would be acceptable to President Vladimir Putin. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has already rejected proposals that have been discussed by the Trump transition team. Bloomberg reported on Wednesday that Putin is expected to ask Trump for a guarantee that Ukraine won't ever join NATO, which has been Moscow's main demand since before the invasion was launched in February 2022. Waltz has said that Trump's Putin call, it's expected to happen in the coming days or weeks. So let's move on now and talk about this Gaza ceasefire deal and hostage exchange. And so Israel and Hamas reached Gaza ceasefire and hostage deal. This one from Dave DeCamp, January 15th, not the 20th, because that hasn't happened yet, at antiwar.com. So Dave writes, after over 15 months of Israel's U.S.-backed genocidal war on Gaza, Israel and Hamas have reached a hostage and ceasefire deal, an agreement first announced by President-elect Donald Trump. Hamas confirmed on Wednesday that it approved the deal, and Israeli officials had told the media an agreement was reached, although it still needs to be formally approved by the Israeli government, which is expected to happen on Thursday. Later on Wednesday, hours after the U.S. and Qatar announced the deal was reached, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu claimed an agreement still hasn't been reached and said the details will be finalized tonight. According to a source speaking with NBC News, once the Israeli government approved the deal, the Israeli Supreme Court would then have 24 hours to appeal decisions. The Qatari Prime Minister said that the ceasefire will take effect on Sunday, day before Trump's inauguration. According to media reports, the deal involves 3 phases meant to lead to a permanent end to the conflict and the reconstruction in Gaza. However, details of the second and third phases still need to be negotiated, and Israel could potentially restart military operations after the first phase. The first phase involves a 42-day ceasefire during which Hamas will release 33 Israeli hostages. In exchange, Israel is expected to release hundreds or possibly thousands of Palestinian prisoners. And Israeli troops will withdraw within 1 kilometer of the Gaza border, an area where the IDF has destroyed every building in the so-called buffer zone. Aid will also be surged to Gaza with 600 trucks expected to enter the strip per day. So Trump wrote on Truth Social, and this is in all caps, "We have a deal for the hostages in the Middle East. They will be released shortly. Thank you." A post came before any official statement from Biden or his administration. In a second post, Trump wrote, "This epic ceasefire agreement could only happen as a result of our historic victory in November, as a signal to the entire world that my administration would seek peace and negotiate deals to ensure the safety of all Americans and our allies." The president-elect added, "With this deal in place, my national security team, through the efforts of Special Envoy to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff, would continue to work closely with Israel and our allies to make sure Gaza never again becomes a terrorist safe haven." According to Israeli media, the pressure Witkoff put on Netanyahu is what led to a deal. The Biden administration has refused to put any pressure on Netanyahu, allowing him to sabotage previous efforts. And as 60 Minutes reported earlier this week, the White House told them that they felt that any effort to pressure Netanyahu would lead to a longer and deadlier conflict, which this is kind of proven to be untrue. So Palestinians are celebrating the news as a ceasefire. The happiness is literally eternal. Gaza's streets are erupting. The tears of everyone, the joy, a journalist in Gaza wrote on X. So ahead of the news, Israel ramped up airstrikes on Gaza. According to the health ministry's daily update, Israel killed at least 62 Palestinians and wounded 253 others in the previous 2-hour period. According to Abed, 2 journalists were among those killed by Israel on Wednesday. So this is interesting that, we had this announcement of a ceasefire. Now, unfortunately, just before I recorded this morning, Netanyahu let it be known, and his office put out a statement to the international press that the Israeli cabinet won't meet to approve a ceasefire until Hamas backs down on a last-minute crisis. And what the Prime Minister's office is claiming is that this deal was agreed to by all parties, but then Hamas came in at the last minute and attempted to change the deal. From Hamas's side, this is not what they're saying. They're saying that they've approved the ceasefire, that there's no further negotiations. So it's really unclear what's actually going on here. I think there's a couple possibilities. The first is that Netanyahu is actively trying to scuttle the ceasefire deal. I think that's the most likely, that he's trying to throw on last-minute negotiations after last-minute negotiations on Hamas to try to exact more and more concessions from the group. And short of that, he'll be able to say, well, it was Hamas's inability to negotiate, it was their inability to accept the terms that needed to be accepted that ultimately led to the renewed fighting. And then, he no longer has to worry about a hostage deal, right? It's like resetting things for the new administration to roll out a new piece of propaganda that, once again, it's Hamas that's the problem. The Israelis are willing to agree. They're willing to make a deal. It's just these savages in Gaza that won't do it. Of course, it's completely blown up by the fact that this deal was on the table in July. And so there's probably Israeli hostages who had died between then and now who could have been saved if Netanyahu accepted this deal at that point, but he refused to do so. Now, another possibility, and I'm not necessarily just trying to give Netanyahu cover here or anything like that, is that the prime minister's office may be scrambling to put something together behind the scenes to actually get approval for this ceasefire deal. So this is from Dave DeCamp. This broke just as soon as the ceasefire deal was announced. On Wednesday, the Israeli finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, slammed the Israeli-Hamas ceasefire deal and said his religious Zionism party would quit the coalition government unless they were sure Israel's genocidal war in Gaza would resume at, quote, full force. So Smotrich wrote on X, a clear condition for our remaining in the government is an absolute certainty of returning to war with great force. On a full scale and in new configuration until complete victory over all its components. Foremost among them, the destruction of Hamas terrorist organization and the return of all hostages to their homes. According to Al Mayadeen, Israeli media reported that Smotrich had given conditions to Netanyahu for staying in his government, which included guarantees that military operations will resume after the first phase of the ceasefire deal, which is a 42-day ceasefire period. The document Smotrich submitted to Netanyahu called for increased military force in the next phase of the fighting, utilizing additional means and significantly reducing humanitarian aid into Gaza. Under the ceasefire deal, the details of the second and third phases won't be negotiated until the first phase takes effect, which means Israel hasn't committed to a permanent ceasefire and could potentially resume military operations after 42 days or just whenever they want. So Smotrich wrote on X, in the last 2 days, the Prime Minister and I have been holding feverish conversations on the matter. He knows the details of demands of the religious Zionism, and the ball is in his hands. The comments came a day after the National Security Minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, threatened his Jewish Power Party would quit the government if a hostage deal is reached, and called on Smotrich to join him. If the Jewish Power and religious Zionism quit, the coalition would lose its majority in the Knesset, which could lead to early elections. However, the opposition, led by former Prime Minister Yair Lapid, has said he would help Netanyahu stay in power if he agrees to a ceasefire deal. I don't think Netanyahu necessarily wants to have to rely on Yair Lapid in his coalition, though, so I think it may be possible that Netanyahu is blaming Hamas on any kind of delays here, when really it's unable to organize the extremists in his own government to accept the deal that he wants them to accept. So, there's a lot going on here, a lot of developing. First, I want to say that until this ceasefire is put into place, the situation in Gaza is likely to get significantly worse. We have seen this on battlefields across the world, I guess. I can't really think of an example where this doesn't happen, but particularly in Israeli bombing campaigns, that there's a ceasefire reached with Hamas, with Hezbollah, any other group, they do significantly ramp up their bombing in the days after the ceasefire was agreed to, but before it takes effect. And so, in a different situation, like say the war in Ukraine, you imagine that both sides would be scrambling to carry out more territory. In the Israeli case, they're just trying to inflict as much death as they can upon the Palestinians while they are able to do so. So this is, my prediction here is that this ceasefire deal, if it does materialize, it certainly doesn't meaningfully extend past the initial 42-day period. Much more likely doesn't even make it through the full 42-day period. The idea that Israel is going to not carry out airstrikes for 6 weeks in Gaza seems insane, especially given that they made a 60-day ceasefire in southern Lebanon, and they've continued to bomb that area almost daily since. Now, it has been a scaled-back bombing campaign compared to what was going on before the ceasefire, but still significant bombing campaign in southern Lebanon since the ceasefire was agreed to. Additionally, the 608 trucks a day is, I think, where Israel will just not allow that. They may let it go up from the 71 a day that it's currently at, but I do not think that they're going to allow hundreds, especially over 500 trucks of aid into Gaza each day. And so it remains to be seen what's going to happen here. We have Trump administration officials that I think are more or less making it clear that they don't expect Israel to actually implement a full, lasting, and permanent ceasefire in Gaza. The National Security Advisor Mike Waltz explained that Hamas has to be completely eliminated. And that hasn't happened yet. In fact, this next story from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com, Blinkin says Hamas has recruited as many new fighters as it has lost. So on Tuesday, Secretary of State Antony Blinken delivered a speech at the Atlantic Council where he said Hamas has likely recruited as many fighters as it lost in Gaza. Before making comments about Hamas, Blinken was interrupted by a protester who called him the Secretary of Genocide for his role in enabling Israel's genocidal war. You will be forever known as Bloody Blinken, Secretary of Genocide. You have the blood of hundreds of thousands of innocent people on your hands, the protester yelled. Blinken went on to criticize Israel's strategy in Gaza, despite backing it for nearly a year and a half. He said, "We've long made the point to the Israeli government that Hamas cannot be defeated by military campaign alone. Without a clear alternative, a post-conflict plan, a credible political horizon for the Palestinians, Hamas, or something just abhorrent and dangerous will grow back," Blinken said. Which is, crazy. He's saying that the Israelis are just needlessly killing in Gaza. Oh, but by the way, I'm going to approve another $8 billion sale of bombs, artillery shells, and missiles for Israel. Absolute insanity. So he noted that Israel was still facing resistance in northern Gaza. He explained that's exactly what happened in northern Gaza since October 7th. Each time Israel completes its military operations and pulls back, Hamas militant groups and reemerge because there's nothing else to fill the void. Blinken said the U.S. assesses that Hamas has recruited almost as many new militants as it has lost, and that is a recipe for enduring insurgency and perpetual war. So back in November of 2023, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Charles Q. Brown, the highest-ranking U.S. military officer, warned Israel that Israel's killing of so many civilians would create more Hamas members. Despite Brown recognizing this reality, the U.S. continued to provide Israel with huge amounts of military aid to support the slaughter. According to the Times of Israel, Israel assesses that it has killed 18,000 Hamas fighters, although Israeli military media reveal the IDF frequently kills unarmed civilians and counts them as terrorists. And if you notice, throughout the conflict, Israel has tried to keep the number of Hamas soldiers that it claims it's killed in line with the number of children that the Gaza Health Ministry says have been killed by the Israeli onslaught. I guess they figure if, there's 10,000 dead children and only 1,000 dead members of Hamas. Well, with those kind of numbers, a lot of Americans just hearing that are going to be instantly turned off and disgusted. You're killing 10 children per every Hamas fighter that you kill. You say you're the most accurate and moral army in history. How could that possibly be the case? But that is likely the case. And, Israel just puts out this propaganda and it's repeated by the U.S. media. So Blinken's address at the Atlantic Council came as reports of a hostage and ceasefire deal are close. Since May of 2024, Hamas said it was ready to accept a ceasefire deal proposed by President Biden, but Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu repeatedly sabotaged the negotiations, a fact widely acknowledged by Israeli officials and media. But Blinken is still pushing the narrative that the lack of a ceasefire is Hamas's fault. He said, for the past several months, Hamas has played the spoiler, but over the past several weeks, our intensive efforts have brought us to the brink of a final agreement. According to Israeli media, the difference made in recent days was the pressure of President-elect Donald Trump's incoming Middle East envoy put on Netanyahu, not anything Blinken or anyone else in the administration did. All right, one more story on Gaza before we move on here. Arab official says Trump envoy did more to pressure Israel in one meeting than Biden did all year. So President-elect Donald Trump's incoming Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff did more to pressure Israel to agree to a hostage and ceasefire deal in one meeting with Netanyahu than President Biden did in an entire year, two Arab officials have told the Times of Israel. Witkoff met with Netanyahu in Jerusalem on Saturday and got him to make concessions, which the Israeli media says was the deciding factor that led to a ceasefire deal announced on Wednesday. While it's unclear still if that deal will take effect and what Witkoff did to get Netanyahu to agree to the deal, but the Biden administration refused to use any leverage over Israel to force a deal and continued to provide huge amounts of military aid to support the genocidal slaughter in Gaza. Even though Witkoff played a crucial role in the deal, Biden took credit for the agreement. He said, "My diplomacy never ceased in the efforts to get this done." In brief remarks at the White House, Biden credited his foreign policy team, who he referred to as peacemakers, despite their role in backing the slaughter and genocide in Gaza. When asked by a reporter if Trump should get credit for the deal, Biden turned and said, "Is that a joke?" and then walked off. So Biden credited his strong backing of Israel as a deciding factor in the deal, but unconditional U.S. military support emboldened Netanyahu to sabotage previous negotiations and escalate elsewhere in the region, such as Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen. So let's talk about Lebanon real quick. Israel continues ceasefire violations as new Lebanon Prime Minister promises to rebuild. So Jason Ditz writes here for antiwar.com, with around 12 days remaining in the 60-day Israeli ceasefire with Lebanon, Israel continues to commit multiple violations per day. A number of airstrikes are being conducted in southern and eastern Lebanon, along with systematic destruction of civilian homes and villages near the Israeli border. Israel is supposed to entirely withdraw from its military from Lebanese territory by the end of the ceasefire, but U.S. Special Envoy has guaranteed that will happen, though there remain substantial questions about that, and the places Israel has left have been more or less destroyed during their occupation. And so if they are leaving a village, they're utterly destroying it. And I think this could be really predictive or telling for what could happen in Gaza, what's happened in southern Lebanon, where I don't see any reason to think that Israel is actually going to follow through with this. All right, now moving on to Syria, Israel continues, wrong article here, one second. So this article, Israel kills 2 soldiers and civilian in first attacks on new Syrian government forces. So concerns about Israel's newfound hostility towards Syria's Islamist government, run by al-Qaeda-linked Tahrir al-Sham, grew substantially today after an Israeli drone attacked a military convoy belonging to the new government in southern Syria. 3 people were killed, 2 soldiers and a civilian. Despite hundreds of Israeli airstrikes on the remnants of Assad's government across Syria in recent months, this is significant because it's the first time Israel has attacked active personnel with the new post-Assad government. Israel was supposed to be happy with the regime change, and Prime Minister Netanyahu even took credit for Assad's ouster last month. This did come with Israel's invasion and occupation of significant territory in southern Syria, though including parts of Quneitra and the Dara governance. In recent days, Israel has been more openly hostile towards HTS and used this as an excuse for extending their occupation of those parts of Syria indefinitely. HTS has talked about trying to be on friendly terms with Israel, but this doesn't seem to be in the cards at the end of the day. All right, last up here, I have a brand new op-ed out. It's running at antiwar.com, the Libertarian Institute, and also over on judgenaps.com. It's titled Joe Biden's Legacy: Waging Proxy Wars, Spreading Terrorism, and Killing Diplomacy. So as the sun sets on Joe Biden's presidency, the commander-in-chief and his top staffers are using their final moments in power to convince the American people that we live in a safer and more stable world. Joe Biden declared on Monday, the U.S. is winning worldwide competition compared to 4 years ago. America is stronger. Our alliances are stronger. Our adversaries and competitors are weaker. The claims that America is winning and strong are as laughable as when the mainstream media repeatedly attempted to convince the American people that Biden was, quote, as sharp as a tack. Americans have witnessed Biden's physical and cognitive decline over the past 4 years, which perfectly personifies the American empire. Rather than becoming stronger, the treasury and arms depots were exhausted for the benefits of Ukraine and Israel. America is bankrupt. Economic prosperity is increasingly elusive for the average citizen and enjoyed only by an exclusive class with access to government power. Of course, it is likely that Biden's legacy will ultimately be a discussion about the war in Ukraine. When Biden first shuffled into the Oval Office, it was not predetermined that Russian President Vladimir Putin would order the invasion of Ukraine. Sure, Biden took office at a low point in the U.S.-Russian relationship. The American media spent over 4 years poisoning the discourse about Moscow with the false saga of Russiagate. Then President Donald Trump failed to make good on his campaign pledge in 2016 to improve Washington's ties with Moscow. When Trump entered the White House in 2021, it followed 4 years of Trump's sanctions, expelling Russian diplomats from the U.S., destroying arms controls agreements, expanding NATO, and arming Ukraine. Still, Biden and his staff had ample time to address these issues. One of Biden's first acts as president was to extend the New START treaty with Russia, an agreement that capped the country's nuclear weapons programs. Despite Russian overtures eyeing future cooperation on arms control, Biden refused to resurrect the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty or the Open Skies Pact that Washington had abandoned during Trump's first term. Then, the Biden administration began treating Ukraine as a member of NATO. In response, near the end of 2021, Moscow sent Washington a proposal to avert war in Ukraine. Kiev's membership in NATO, as the Kremlin explained, was a red line that threatened Moscow's core security concerns. It was clear that the Kremlin would go to war to prevent Ukraine's ascension into the American-led military bloc. Rather than consider the Russian proposal and sit with Moscow for talks, the Biden administration never seriously considered the diplomatic route. Senior American Biden administration official Derek Chollet explained after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, "We made clear to the Russians that we were willing to talk to them on issues that we thought were genuine concerns they were legitimate in some way. I mean, arms control type of things of that nature." And he concluded this was not about Ukraine's membership into NATO. Time has proven this notion false, as over 2 years into the war, Putin's demands remain mostly unchanged. Moscow is calling for Ukrainian neutrality and recognition of annexed territory. After the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there was nearly an agreement brokered in Turkey just a month into the conflict. When Kiev nearly accepted the deal, then UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson was dispatched to Ukraine to talk Zelensky out of signing the pact. Months later, the Washington Post revealed a crucial truth about the war in Ukraine. While Biden and his team claimed that the war in Ukraine was about Ukrainian sovereignty and defending innocent lives, the truth is that the White House chose to fight the proxy war in Ukraine rather than negotiate because they thought the conflict would leave Russia weakened. Over the past 2.5 years, Biden has spent nearly $200 billion on weapons and cash for the Kiev regime. Rather than securing Ukrainian sovereignty and democracy, the war has cost Ukraine 4 new regions annexed by Moscow. Additionally, Zelensky has effectively killed democracy in Ukraine. The press has been nationalized, religious freedoms have been abolished, and elections have been canceled. All right, now moving on to Israel. Biden's second proxy war in the Middle East is Israel. Since October 7, 2023, the White House has provided Israel with $22 billion in military aid. Israel has used that money and those weapons to unleash all hell across the region, mostly targeting the Palestinians and their supporters. Gaza is utterly destroyed, with the dead numbering at least in the tens of thousands. It appears that southern Lebanon is beginning to look like Gaza, with Israel destroying village after village in an attempt to prevent Lebanese people from ever returning to their homes. In Syria, Bashar al-Assad was overthrown by American, Turkish, and Ukrainian-backed bloc of jihadists. Now, Abu Mohammed al-Jolani, an al-Qaeda veteran of the Iraq War, rules Damascus. His new government is made up of members of his militia, Tahrir al-Sham, a designated for a terrorist organization by the U.S. State Department. Tel Aviv has exploited the downfall of Assad to seize a huge swath of Syria's southern territory and drop hundreds of bombs on military sites across the country. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has also unleashed the Israeli Air Force on Yemen, often bombing civilian targets, including ports and other vital infrastructure. The Yemen Data Project reported in December that Israeli strikes in Yemen killed 15 civilians and only targeted non-military sites. With the Middle East on fire and war with Iran looming, Israel's acceleration of its march towards annexing the West Bank has largely gone unnoticed in the Western press. Hundreds of Palestinians have been killed, thousands thrown into prisons, and entire families were displaced when their homes were destroyed. At the same time, Palestinians are being removed from the West Bank. Tel Aviv is announcing many new Jewish-only settlements that will be established in the occupied territory. Haiti. All too often, Biden's proxy war in Haiti goes completely forgotten. As Biden came into office, Haitians began arriving at the American southern border. In September of 2021, U.S. border security forces were photographed on horseback, appearing to whip Haitians trying to cross from Mexico. The images were deeply embarrassing to Biden, who cast Trump as a dictator in part because of his harsh immigration policies. The White House determined the best way to prevent more Haitians from arriving at the U.S. border was to organize an invasion of Port-au-Prince by a third country with the approval of the UN Security Council. For years, Washington tried and failed to persuade Ottawa and other allies to agree to send their troops to the Caribbean nation. In 2023, the Biden administration was finally able to bribe Kenya into sending its troops to Haiti in exchange for increased defense cooperation, military aid, and Nairobi becoming a major non-NATO ally. The plan to deploy Kenyan troops to Haiti imploded before it even started. When the American-installed leader in Port-au-Prince, Ariel Henry, traveled to Nairobi to sign the agreement to deploy Kenyan troops to Haiti, gangs and paramilitaries rose up in Port-au-Prince and prevented Henry from returning and forcing his resignation. Washington then created a new government for the Haitian people, but even with the support of the Kenyan soldiers who finally arrived in 2024, the situation has continued to deteriorate in Port-au-Prince. Murders in Haiti increased by 20% last year to over 5,600. Why do all this? Well, it may seem odd to name Ukraine and Israel as U.S. proxies. After all, the Biden administration has struggled to control Kiev and Tel Aviv. However, the outgoing administration seemed to develop policies around the very simple idea that weakening American enemies and strengthening our allies are the only policy end goals. If Israel conducts a genocide in Gaza, that is fine because it's strengthening Israel to crush any potential resistance ever emerging from the besieged Gaza Strip. There are no concerns that the daily pictures of dead Palestinian children would cause violent flourishings of anti-American sentiments, inspiring terror attacks against U.S. troops and civilians. If Assad is overthrown in Syria, that is good because now Damascus can't stand up to Tel Aviv or allow Iran to support Hezbollah. Never mind the man who founded al-Qaeda's affiliate in Syria now rules the country. If Russia squanders its blood and treasure in Ukraine, that's a victory even if Ukrainian lives are being fed to a meat grinder at a decidedly more furious pace. Today, Biden will claim victory because Russia has not achieved its war objectives in Ukraine, and Iran can no longer ship weapons to southern Lebanon via Syria. Nevertheless, history will remember the Joe Biden administration for creating wars when acceptable peace was on the table and the hundreds of thousands of corpses those conflicts produced. All right, everyone, with that, I'm going to wrap up the show for today. Thank you all so much for tuning in and giving me your support. We will have another episode of the Kyle Anzalone Show out this week. This is probably the last episode of Conflicts of Interest for the week, so Conflicts of Interest returns next week, but be sure to subscribe to the Kyle Anzalone Show channel so you catch the last episode of that show for this week that I'm putting out tonight. I think I got a pretty good one lined up for y'all. So again, thanks for all your support. See you soon.